Hey everybody, this is a section from Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. It's from a chapter titled The World Revolution, and it's about prospects for world revolution in Trotsky's eyes in the 1920s. And in the post-revolutionary period in Russia. And it starts with a footnote, actually. The remainder of this chapter deals with Trotsky's views on the world revolution during the 1917 to 24 period only, the controversy over socialism in one country, which is a natural breaking off point, forms the main subject of the next chapter, though some writings from the year 1924 are referred to in this chapter. End footnote. So here we go. In the event, of course, things did not work out quite as Trotsky had hoped and expected. Although Trotsky proved to be right about the prospects of revolution in Russia, Trotsky was wrong about such prospects in Europe, particularly in Germany. Yet it took some time before Trotsky came to terms with the fact that the revolutions were not to follow one another in some inexorable fashion. For a year or two, Trotsky still believed that the European conflagration was imminent, as did indeed other Bolsheviks, including Lenin. Footnote. For a detailed account of the ideological basis for Soviet internationalism from 1917 onwards, see Elliot R. Goodman, The Soviet Design for a World State. Let's see if anything comes up for this. Yeah, I'm not seeing any description for this book. Also, an earlier but still useful work, Michael T. Florinsky, World Revolution in the USSR, published in 1933. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for that book either. So anyway, back to the text. Where am I? But there was a fundamental difference of orientation between Trotsky and Lenin from the very outset, and nothing illustrates this better than their respective attitude towards a peace settlement with Germany. The whole controversy over the controversy over the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the negotiations leading up to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk have been copiously documented by historians, and the matter, in any case, is not of central importance to the scope of the present study. Footnote. The classic study, of course, is that by John W. Wheeler Bennett, Brest-Litovsk, The Forgotten Peace, published in 1938. Let's see if there's anything for that. According to Google Books, it says it's about the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, a peace treaty signed on the 3rd of March 1918 at Brest-Litovsk, now Brest, Belarus, between the RSFSR and the Central Powers, marking Russia's exit from World War I. Back to the text. Deutscher, the Prophet Armed, gives an account which concentrates on Trotsky's position and Trotsky's differences with Lenin. Trotsky's speeches at the negotiations are in something in Russian, edited by A.A. Yofa, with a preface by Trotsky, published in 1920, and in Trotsky's Russian Collected Works, Book 3, Part 2, and also in Book 17, Part 1. The latter also contains various articles by Trotsky on the negotiations. For Trotsky's views on Brest-Litovsk in later years, see in particular his My Life, Book 2. Trotsky here confessed that Lenin was right in pressing for peace at all cost, and Trotsky wrong in his opposition, This is another typical example of Trotsky's unabashed deference to Lenin in the years when their past differences were being resurrected against Trotsky. End footnote. It will be, end footnote. It will be sufficient, therefore, to note only the basis for the different attitudes of Trotsky and Lenin in order to grasp Trotsky's point of departure for the policies towards Europe Trotsky advocated then and thereafter. As we have seen above, Trotsky believed that a war launched with the support of the European Social Democrats was a disaster for the revolutionary movement in general. But war itself, or the particular conditions created by war, could be a precipitant of revolution, and, obviously, the more costly the war effort and the more distant the prospects of victory, the more likely did revolution become. This was certainly proven to be the case in Russia, and Trotsky believed that it could also become the case in Germany. In negotiating the peace with Germany, therefore, Trotsky took the position that everything should be done with this consideration in mind. True, the main concern was peace for Russia, and Lenin was undoubtedly right that unless this was achieved, the Soviet government would go the way of its predecessors. But Trotsky believed that to accept peace on the conditions stipulated by the Germans was to serve the Germans politically, and thereby to waste the opportunity of contributing towards an upheaval in Germany. Moreover, in the long run, should Germany succeed in avoiding revolution, this would have a disastrous effect on the progress of the revolution in Russia. The famous formula Trotsky coined, quote, "neither war nor peace," end quote, was, therefore, a way, in Trotsky's view, of providing Russia with a relative respite from fighting while simultaneously denying Germany the benefits of a final settlement on the Eastern Front. And it perfectly reflected Trotsky's determination from the outset that Soviet Russia play a positive, active role in the spread of revolution, and that, at least, it do nothing to encourage the forces of, quote, imperialism. Footnote. This brief summary of Trotsky's position regarding a settlement with Germany is based on Trotsky's various speeches and writings on the subject, the sources for which have been mentioned in the previous note. End footnote. Certainly Lenin shared this determination. Lenin recognized no less than Trotsky the importance of a German revolution and was obviously not adverse to contributing to the German Revolution's outbreak. A German Revolution outbreak. Footnote. On Lenin, Germany, and the Treaty of Brest-Litov, see page chapters 6 and 7. See also George Katkov, Russia 1917, the February Revolution, for an unorthodox interpretation of Lenin's involvement with the German government and therefore of the motives for Lenin's subsequent policies towards Germany. I'm going to look this book up. I don't see anything for it. End footnote. Where am I, though? I lost my spot. All right. But Lenin's list of priorities was different. Lenin's first concern was to put Lenin's own house in order. If the best, most sure way of safeguarding the Soviet regime was to conclude a peace, however humiliating, then this way had to be followed. This did not mean, in Lenin's view, abandoning the revolutionary struggle abroad. On the contrary, it meant preserving, collecting, and reorganizing one's strength to fight on another, more propitious day. Lenin, the strategist of world revolution, was there... Oh shit, I think this is a typo. Maybe it's not a typo. Lenin, the strategist of world revolution, was therefore like Lenin, the strategist of the Russian Revolution. Nevertheless, this element of pragmatism or expediency reflected Lenin's fundamentally Russian or internal-oriented approach as against Trotsky's international orientation. Here lay the source of the differences over external policy which were to become particularly conspicuous in later years, though less so between Trotsky and Lenin than between Trotsky and Lenin's eventual successor. It bears repeating, however, that while Trotsky's commitment to an internationalist position grew, perhaps out of Trotsky's own personal frame of mind, on the level of rational argumentation it took the form that the Russian Revolution cannot survive without world revolution. And this belief in the interdependence of revolutions continued to guide Trotsky's thinking in subsequent years. By the time, however, the establishment of the Third International in March 1919, the situation in Europe, from the point of view of Soviet Russia, was already evolving in a complicated direction. Footnote: on the early as well as the later history of the Comintern, see in particular Franz Birkenau's World Communism. Originally published as The Communist International in 1938 in London, and Hugh Seton Watson, From Lenin to Khrushchev, The History of World Communism. Let's see if there's anything for these books. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for Franz Birkenau. The abstract for Hugh Seton Watson's From Lenin to Khrushchev, The History of World Communism says, this book is intended to be both less and more than a survey of communism in the world today or a history of communist movements. This book focuses on the relationship of communist movements to social classes and to the internal balance of political power in their respective countries. So that's Hugh Seton Watson's From Lenin to Khrushchev, The History of World Communism. Back to the text and footnote. True, approximately at the same time, a Soviet regime was established in Hungary, but Belakun's communists managed to last only a few months, and in Germany, still the crux of the whole revolutionary matter, the, quote, November Revolution of 1918 was not leading to an equivalent of the, quote, Russian October. The Berlin insurrection of January 1919 had ended in debacle and tragedy for the Spartacus League, and in May, army troops were to bring to a bloody end the attempt by communists to assume power in Bavaria. In the meantime, of course, Soviet Russia was in the midst of the Civil War. Nevertheless, the political situation in Germany and elsewhere in Europe remained sufficiently unsettled to allow the Bolsheviks the hope that in the end the European proletariat would find a way of fulfilling the European proletariat's promise and that the Russian Revolution would not remain an isolated event. During its first years, therefore, the Comintern, under the leadership and eventually the domination of the Bolsheviks, was above all concerned with a revolutionary strategy for Europe. And Trotsky, who often appeared at Comintern sessions as the spokesman of the Soviet government, in numerous speeches and writings during the period of 1919 to 24, attempted to provide a conceptual basis for such a strategy. Footnote. The main source for Trotsky's views as presented in what follows is his Piat let com interna, published in Moscow, 1924. This consists of various speeches, declarations, and writings during the period of 1919 to the end of 1923. Volume 13 of Trotsky's Russian collected works is also devoted to the Comintern, but its contents are reproduced almost entirely in Piat let Kominterna, which moreover contains other writings not included in Trotsky's Russian collected writings. For the English translation, see Trotsky, The First 5 Years of the Communist International, 2 volumes. Back to, end footnote. He did not, of course, have one single uniform strategy for the whole period, since the situation in Europe, particularly in Germany and France, was continuously changing. Nevertheless, all his policies were guided by certain assumptions about Europe which he never abandoned, and by a general consistent conception of the relation between the Soviet government and European developments. As to his assumptions about Europe, an article he wrote in April 1919 may serve as a representative text. And this text, the footnote says something in Russian. Not surprisingly, its main argument was that the traditionally accepted belief that proletarian revolution was more likely the more advanced the capitalist countries had not only to be revised, but in fact jettisoned. This was, of course, the central theme of all Trotsky's writings about the Russian Revolution for more than a decade. In evaluating now the, quote, progress of revolution in Europe, not only the influence of the Russian case, but its analogy for Europe was uppermost in his mind. Just as Russia, the most backward of countries in comparison with Europe, was the first to experience a workers' revolution, so in Europe itself, it was the least advanced societies which would collapse first. Quote, from Russia, bracket, the revolution, end bracket, passed over into Hungary, from Hungary to Bavaria, ... Hungary is unquestionably the more backward half of the former Austro-Hungarian monarchy, which, as a whole, in the sense of capitalist and even cultural political development, stood between Russia and Germany. Bavaria ... represents with respect to capitalist development, not the advanced, but, on the contrary, a backward section of Germany. Thus the proletarian revolution, after starting in the most backward country of Europe, bracket, i.e. Russia, end bracket, keeps mounting upwards, rung by rung, towards countries more highly developed economically, end quote. Trotsky. As Trotsky had argued years ago against a, quote, mechanical, end quote, interpretation of Marxism in the case of Russia, so now Trotsky rejected the accepted, quote, mechanical, end quote, view of Europe according to which the revolution would begin in England, the most developed capitalist nation, proceed to France, and only thence to Germany. The order had in fact been reversed, and to understand the reasons for this reversal, it was necessary, in Trotsky's view, to look at the nature of modern capitalism. Here we are on familiar ground. The socio-cultural interpretation of capitalism which Trotsky first raised when discussing the weakness and vulnerability of Russian capitalism, and to which he now returned. Firstly, Trotsky argued, the order capitalist development was, the more time it has had to become structured and institutionalized, to develop a complete way of life in which society and economics were one. Secondly, as in the case of England in particular, being first meant a long period of virtual monopoly over economic resources, thus an industrial structure had been created able to exploit its own full potential, and that of its colonies virtually unhindered by competition. Thus also it had been able to isolate its workers and to create internal mechanisms for preventing their access to instruments of power. Thirdly, the more developed the proletariat, the more it inclined to organize within the framework of the, quote, bourgeois political structure, which, in return for this adherence to its rules, was prepared to provide certain economic and social benefits. Hence the conservatism of the trade union movement, hence all the growth of economic differentiation within the proletariat, encouraged by capitalism, resulting in a relative absence of class solidarity or united interests. In contrast to this, Trotsky continued, those countries where capitalist development had been late and slow were unable to create internal equilibrium between their economic innovation and their entrenched feudal social structure. Capitalism, insofar as capitalism had been introduced, had imposed new forms of production without a parallel socio-cultural development. Thus the anomalies, the contradictions, the asymmetry, the instability, the fragility of the whole phenomenon. But this was as yet not enough to make for revolution. The point at which the collapse could begin was reached once capitalism extended, capitalism self, beyond national borders, turned into imperialism, resorted to war, and engulfed within its orbit necessarily the newer and weaker capitalist nations. Thus, countries with a, quote, younger capitalist culture are the first to enter the path of civil war, inasmuch as the unstable equilibrium of class forces is most easily disrupted precisely in these countries, end quote. Trotsky. Quote, precisely because of the entire preceding development, the task of initiating the revolution, as we have already seen, was not placed on an old proletariat with mighty political and trade union organizations, with massive traditions of parliamentarism and trade unionism, but upon the young proletariat of a backward country. History took the line of least resistance. The revolutionary epoch burst in through the most weakly barricaded door, end quote. Trotsky. The phenomenon of Russia, therefore, would be repeated, Trotsky believed, within the context of Europe also. There, too, history would take the, quote, line of least resistance, end quote. And the lesson to be drawn from this for practical purposes was that all revolutionary efforts, through the Comintern and within individual countries, must be geared to this order of development and not to that of, quote, mechanical, outdated preconceptions. If this constituted the first and most fundamental of Trotsky's assumptions about the European Revolution, it was accompanied by a second one about the general vulnerability of European capitalism, the crisis it was going through and the eruption it must necessarily suffer. Even by the middle of 1921, when the revolutionary wave of the previous years already appeared to have been repulsed, Trotsky remained confident that this was merely a temporary setback and that the capitalist system, far from, quote, restoring, end quote, itself, was in the process of continued disintegration. Trotsky's confidence, as usual, grew out of a combination of determinist presumptions about the nature of capitalism and what can only be called, quote, wishful thinking. Trotsky's confidence was based, firstly, on the standard Marxist analysis of the inherent contradictions within capitalism, capitalism's class antagonisms, capitalism's inability to expand without increasing exploitation or risking war, capitalism's dependence on scarce markets, capitalism's failure to provide for the economic needs of the masses, and so on. This, Trotsky thought, was even truer now than it was in Marx's day. But beyond this, there had taken place, in Trotsky's view, developments which had led to an aggravation of the endemic capitalist crisis. Having become a tightly knit international system, capitalism was vulnerable at any one of a number of connecting points. The economy of one country was dependent on that of another. A crisis in one was a crisis for all. Moreover, the World War, far from culminating in the domination of one capitalist power over another, had ended with the whole of Europe in ruins, the victors no less than the vanquished. Europe came out of the war exhausted, Europe's economy undermined, Europe's people decimated and impoverished, Europe's political leadership bankrupt, and Europe's resources for reconstruction depleted. The result, in Trotsky's view, had been the disruption of the European, quote, equilibrium, end quote. Economic, class, political, and international. Europe, once the center of the world, had become only a shadow of Europe's former self, no longer the, quote, heart of the capitalist world, end quote, nor the master, quote, of all world politics, end quote. Instead, the, quote, center of gravity has shifted from Europe to America, end quote. Trotsky. While the former slumps, the latter grows, exploiting the vacuum created by European decline, coming to dominate old markets in the West and new markets in the East. Evidently, Trotsky envisaged a situation in which the main struggle against capitalism would shift across the oceans to America, while an enfeebled Europe together with Russia would become the foundation of the socialist axis. Nevertheless, the sudden rise in power of America seemed to Trotsky basically illusory and transient. America's post-war, quote, flowering was merely one of those typical capitalist, quote, booms, in this case the result of Europe's decline. This boom would, however, be followed by the inevitable and no less typical capitalist, quote, crisis, resulting from the likely loss of European markets and from competition with Eastern, particularly Japanese markets. In all this, Trotsky revealed, on the one hand, an uncanny power for prophecy. At one point, Trotsky even predicted that America would soon be engulfed in a, quote, depression. And elsewhere, Trotsky hinted at a violent clash between American and Japanese interests. But, on the other hand, Trotsky's fundamental misunderstanding of the relations between the United States and Europe, and therefore his inability to countenance a European recovery, were betrayed by further, quote, prophecies about a war between England and America, which seemed to Trotsky imminent since England could not allow herself to become dominated by the United States. Footnote. In the former, England, Trotsky even gave the year 1924 as the time of the probable clash between the United States and England. End footnote. But, in any case, even the prospect of a, quote, temporary economic recovery in Europe appeared to Trotsky advantageous to the revolutionary movement, as in Russia following the economic improvements of 1910 to 1912. So in Europe, a partial economic restoration would enable the workers to reorganize and reconsolidate their forces, shaking themselves free of the demoralization which impoverishment had subjected them to. So I was seeing if there's a footnote. Then there's none. Thus Trotsky saw light wherever Trotsky looked. The hopelessness of the capitalist world's, quote, struggle for survival appeared to Trotsky incontrovertible. The propitiousness of the times for world revolution hardly questionable. Naturally, quote, victory will not come to us automatically. Victory will require planning, watchfulness, correct tactics, and, quote, strategical maneuvering, end quote, on the part of the Comintern as a whole and the Comintern's individual members. But, essentially, the, quote, world situation and the future perspectives remain profoundly revolutionary, end quote. And this, quote, creates the necessary premises for our victory, end quote. Trotsky. These were Trotsky's assumptions regarding the nature of the post-war capitalist world. Underlying them was his conception of the relationship between this world and the fact of a Soviet, quote, workers' government in Russia. We have already seen how at Brest-Litovsk, Trotsky sought to give expression to the manner in which Trotsky conceived this relationship, to the role of, quote, provoker, which Trotsky wanted Soviet Russia to play in Europe. This was to remain very much the cornerstone of Trotsky's strategy for the Comintern and inevitably the source of later criticism that Trotsky was pursuing an adventurous and irresponsible policy, and that Trotsky was fundamentally uninterested in the fate of Russia and prepared to sacrifice internal stability for the mere promise of some dubious gains in foreign lands. This controversy, which had already begun in Lenin's time but reached its heights only after Lenin's death, shall concern us in the next chapter. Here it will suffice to repeat that Trotsky's reply in self-defense was always that it was impossible to separate the fate of Russia from that of Europe, that the failure of revolution in Europe would inevitably culminate in the failure of the Russian Revolution itself. Moreover, it was certainly not true that Trotsky had Moreover, it was certainly not true that Trotsky at any time advocated the, quote, export of revolution on the point of a bayonet. Trotsky expected military confrontations between Russia and the outside world as a result of the outside world's inability to tolerate the Soviet example, but Trotsky did not counsel military intervention in European affairs. Footnote. In the case of the war with Poland, however, Trotsky did come near the position that war was an instrument of revolution, but this was a special and isolated case, and at any rate, the failure of this example hardly argued for its repetition. For Trotsky's writings on the war in Poland, see his Russian collected writings, volume 17, part 2, and something else in Russian, end footnote. Nevertheless, if Trotsky could not be justly identified with a policy of revolutionary adventurism, there was a certain sense in which Russia seemed to Trotsky to be ultimately of secondary significance. As we have seen, Trotsky never had illusions about the prospects of socialism in Russia alone, and socialism without Europe appeared to Trotsky an impossibility. Soviet Russia had taken the initiative and had become the center of the revolutionary world. But Soviet Russia's role was temporary. It was as if she were, quote, filling in, end quote, for an ailing or delayed actor. Quote, ... We have erected in our country the bulwark of the world revolution, ... But we are defending this bulwark since at the present moment there is no other in the world. When another stronghold is erected in France or in Germany, then the one in Russia will lose 9/10 of its significance, and we shall then go to ... Europe to defend this other and more important stronghold, end quote. Trotsky. And in the previously referred to article of April 1919, Trotsky wrote, quote, the revolutionary, quote, primogeniture of the Russian proletariat is only temporary, ... The dictatorship of the Russian working class will be able to finally entrench the dictatorship of the Russian working class itself and to develop into a genuine, all-sided socialist construction only from the hour when the European working class frees us from the economic yoke of the European bourgeoisie and, having overthrown the European bourgeoisie, comes to our assistance with its organization and its technology. Concurrently, the leading revolutionary role will pass over to the working class with the greater economic and organizational power. If today the center of the Third International lies in Moscow, ... then tomorrow the center will shift westward, to Berlin, to Paris, to London. End quote. Trotsky. Thus, while the road to world revolution began in the East, its ultimate fate remained centered on the West. And as a consequence, it was in the end far more important what happened and was done in Europe than in Russia. Trotsky did not hesitate to reject a Comintern policy aimed at serving particular Russian interests and which was adventuristic from the point of view of the European socialist parties. Quote, ... It is sheer absurdity to believe that we deem, Russian stronghold of the revolution to be the center of the world. It is absurd even to claim that we believe it is our right to demand of you, i.e. the European communists, to make a revolution in Germany or France or Italy whenever this is required by our domestic policy, end quote. Trotsky. Elsewhere, Trotsky wrote, quote, ... Real assistance could not be rendered us by ... artificially provoked uprisings, but only by the revolutionary victory of the European proletariat. The interests of Russia are therefore served by only those movements, those uprisings, which flow from the internal development of the European proletariat, ... For us, the Russian Soviet Republic constitutes only the point of departure for the European and world revolution. The interests of the latter are for us decisive in every major question. End quote. Trotsky. This point of view did not, of course, exclude an active role for the Soviet government in European affairs. On the contrary, Trotsky believed it invited it, though in accordance with European possibilities, not simply Russian needs. In this sense, it both reaffirmed the primacy of Europe and avoided the charge of adventurism. But it was already out of step with what other Bolshevik leaders were thinking about the role and use of the Comintern, and it is doubtful whether Trotsky's words are representative of their views. The, quote, Bolshevization of the Comintern was to turn it eventually into an instrument of Russian interest, and almost simultaneously world revolution itself was to be either abandoned or, quote, shelved. Thus Trotsky, who had continued to affirm the primacy of Europe end of the world revolution would be characterized as, thus Trotsky, who would continue to affirm the primacy of Europe, end of the world revolution would be characterized as, on the one hand, a belittler of Russia, and on the other, an irresponsible adventurist. It would be merely tedious and today hardly illuminating to follow Trotsky's writings during the 1919 to 24 period on revolutionary prospects and developments in the various individual European countries. Trotsky's book, 5 Years of the Comintern, is full of periodic appraisals of the situation in Germany and France and Italy and in England. Footnote: on France, also see the collection by Trotsky, something in Russian, and the excellent French compilation Léon Trotsky, Les Mouvements Communistes en France, 1919 to 1939, published in 1967, part 2 of which is devoted to the period under discussion in this chapter. End footnote. To trace in detail Trotsky's specific proposals for the various countries and at various times would require more space than can be devoted in the context of the present study. Our concern has been rather to present his general conception of the, quote, progress, as he called it, of the European Revolution. Nevertheless, it may be instructive to look briefly at one case, that of Germany, which is fairly representative of Trotsky's general approach to concrete questions of revolutionary policy, and equally of the source of his misreading of the revolutionary potential of Europe. The German case is instructive because the German case shows that for all Trotsky's awareness of the differences between Europe and Russia, Trotsky had become carried away by the Russian example. This expressed itself not only in the general proposition that there was an analogy, albeit of different dimensions, between the backwardness of Russia and the backwardness of Germany, which allowed one to expect similarities of development. Rather, it extended also to practical, quote, operational conclusions, which Trotsky formulated for the German communists. Thus, the tragedy of January 1919 evoked for Trotsky the reaction that the German party would have to study the Russian lesson again if the German party was to succeed in the future. In an article which opened with the words, quote, "The German Revolution bears clear traits of similarity with the Russian," end quote, Trotsky went on to explain why there was nevertheless a, quote, dissimilarity, end quote, in the end result. The problem, Trotsky argued, was the, quote, absence in Germany of a, quote, centralized revolutionary party, end quote, akin to the Bolshevik model. Quote, history bequeathed nothing like this to the German working class. The German working class is compelled not only to fight for power but to create its organization and train future leaders in the very course of this struggle. ... In the absence of a centralized revolutionary party with a combat leadership whose authority is universally accepted by the working masses, in the absence of linking combat nuclei and leaders, tried in action and tested in experience throughout the various centers and regions of the proletarian movement, this movement, upon breaking out onto the streets, became of necessity intermittent, chaotic, creeping in character, end quote. Trotsky. Clearly, therefore, what was missing in Germany was Bolshevism, that, quote, precondition for a socialist revolution which, in 1917, Trotsky had come to recognize as indispensable. Why it was missing, Trotsky had already indicated in the past, and Trotsky now emphasized the explanation. The very size of German social democracy, its success in building a mass movement, and an enormous party and trade union organization, converted it into an institution which saw itself as an integral part of existing German society so that, eventually, it became a, quote, auxiliary organ of the bourgeois state designed to discipline the proletariat, end quote. Thus, the leadership was more interested in protecting the parliamentary and trade union power already attained than risking a direct confrontation with the state. Thus, it had turned, quote, revisionist and conservative, and thus, when all other revolutionary conditions presented themselves after the war, it proved incapable of providing revolutionary leadership. Quote, precisely because the German working class had expended most of the German working class's energy in the previous epoch upon self-sufficient organizational construction, in a new epoch, at the moment of its transition to open revolutionary struggle for power, the German working class proved to be extremely defenseless organizationally, end quote. Trotsky agreed that the more difficult conditions under which the Marxist movement was forced to function in Russia ironically made possible the growth of a superior revolutionary leadership. Obviously, the German socialist movement could not emulate such conditions, but the lesson it had to learn from the Russian experience was that only by direct confrontation and struggle, and not through compromise, could a truly revolutionary organization be created. It was, in Trotsky's view, the, quote, one and only road along which the class uprisings of the German proletariat can unfold, end quote. And the, quote, strikes, insurrections, and battles, end quote, of the post-war period suggested that the German workers had indeed set out on this road, in spite of the initial failures, which were in Trotsky's view analogous to the failures of 1905 in Russia. The experience of actual combat would bear fruit in the future, as did 1905 in Russia. Thus, Trotsky, in 1919, remained confident about Germany. Quote, the stubborn, unabated erupting and re-erupting, creeping revolution is clearly approaching the critical moment when, having mobilized and trained all its forces in advance for combat, the revolution will deal the class enemy the final mortal blow, end quote. Trotsky. The repeated setbacks in Germany from 1919 to 1923 did not, at first, appreciably alter Trotsky's outlook. Trotsky continued to hold that the key to victory lay in the development of a, quote, combat organization and leadership, though Trotsky simultaneously warned against a strategy which was so unremittingly, quote, offensive-oriented, end quote, in spite of objective conditions, as to verge on adventurism. Even the defeat of 1923, which Trotsky himself admitted constituted a most serious blow to future revolutionary prospects in Germany, was attributed by Trotsky to instrumental factors, weak leadership, faulty strategy, bad timing, and so on. Trotsky was openly critical of the Comintern and, in particular, of the Moscow leadership itself for having hesitated and, in the end, misguided the German communists for reasons having to do with the Moscow leadership's own interest and not those of the German Revolution. But as the full impact of the 1923 defeat began to dawn on Trotsky, Trotsky seemed to realize that the opportunities of the past would not recur, at least not in the same propitious way. Looking back on the post-war period in Germany, Trotsky said, in a speech of July 1924, quote, history never created and will hardly ever again create more favorable preconditions for the proletarian revolution and for the seizure of power, end quote. Was it, however, the fear of confronting more fundamental doubts which compelled Trotsky to add again on this same occasion that what was lacking in Germany was the, quote, degree of tempering, the degree of vision, resolution, and fighting ability of the Communist Party to assure timely action and victory, end quote, question mark. By thus concentrating on and blaming instrumental immediate factors, Trotsky was in fact avoiding larger issues. There is little doubt that Trotsky was right in criticizing the Moscow leadership for the Moscow leadership's ineptitude in 1923. And, certainly, the failure to create a, quote, Bolshevik-type, end quote, party in Germany could be argued to have constituted a stumbling block to revolution there. But all this was more in the realm of the symptoms rather than the causes of the, quote, disease. For the time had surely come instead to pose again the question whether Germany, and Europe in general, was as ripe for socialist revolution as Trotsky had assumed over the years, and it should perhaps have occurred to Trotsky that Bolshevism was a phenomenon peculiar to a country like Russia and not easily given to reproduction in the West. Indeed, when explaining many years before the conditions which had made Bolshevism possible in Russia, Trotsky had more than hinted at this, but Trotsky could not, in any case, bring himself to contemplate a conclusion other than that a, quote, centralized revolutionary party, end quote, would arise in Germany through other developments and ultimately as a result of the revolutionary situation itself, which Trotsky took almost for granted. That did not, or that even if it did, its chances of success would still be more limited than those of the original Bolsheviks in Russia, should surely have suggested that European, quote, capitalism was a more resilient adversary than Marxism had anticipated, and that, perhaps, it was the, quote, revolutionary situation, end quote, itself, which should be taken less for granted. For the truth of the matter was that the Russian precedent was emerging as inapplicable to the West and, as always, far more relevant to the East. That's the end of this section. The next section is titled Revolution in the East. Thank you so much for listening.